Private Robert Leader couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, though God knows there was plenty of that to go around, but from the weight. 72 pounds of steel tanks, rubber hoses, and jellied gasoline strapped to his back like some mechanical parasite, digging into his shoulders with every breath. February 23, 1945, just before dawn, and the air above Iwo Jima tasted like the end of the world. Sulfur from the volcanic soil mixed with cordite smoke and the sweet sick smell of burnt flesh that had been hanging over the island for 4 days straight. He stood 30 yards from the base of Mount Suribachi, staring at a cave mouth that looked like a wound in the black volcanic rock. Somewhere inside that darkness, Japanese voices echoed, faint, almost musical, singing maybe or praying. He couldn't tell. The M2 flamethrower's wand felt obscene in his hands. A metal pipe with a trigger that could summon hell itself. He'd fired it exactly twice in training. Now he was supposed to walk up to that cave and pour fire into it like he was watering a garden. His squad leader, Sergeant Kowalski, crouched beside him, face caked with black sand and old blood. "When I give the word," Kowalski whispered, "you hit that opening with everything. Don't stop until I tell you. And for Christ's sake, don't trip." Leader nodded. His mouth was too dry to answer. Behind them, the rest of the platoon hugged the volcanic slope, rifles ready, eyes hollow from days without sleep. Above, the peak of Suribachi loomed like a dark god, its summit still held by Japanese defenders who had turned every inch of this godforsaken rock into a tomb. The entire island was only 8 square miles, a pork chop-shaped speck in the Pacific that looked from the air like something God had spit out and forgotten. But beneath the surface, General Kuribayashi had built something no American had encountered before. An empire of tunnels, 11 miles of them, dug deep into the volcanic stone, connecting bunkers and fighting positions and command posts in a subterranean fortress designed for one purpose: to kill as many Americans as possible before the inevitable end. This wasn't the first time the U.S. Marines had faced cave warfare. At Tarawa, 2 years earlier, the Japanese had hidden in concrete bunkers and coral fortifications, forcing Marines to crawl forward under murderous fire, clearing each position with grenades and rifle fire and sheer bloody-minded determination. Tarawa had been a revelation of horror, a tiny atoll that cost over 1,000 American lives in 76 hours. Then came Peleliu, where the caves went deeper, where the Japanese had learned to wait in silence until the Marines walked past, then emerged to slaughter them from behind. The flamethrower had been there too, the earlier M1 model, a temperamental beast that sputtered and misfired and sometimes cooked its own operator when the fuel tanks took a bullet. But it worked. Jesus Christ, it worked. When you couldn't dig them out with grenades, when rifle fire just echoed uselessly into the dark, when the enemy was invisible and everywhere at once. Fire answered. Fire went around corners. Fire didn't need to see its target. Fire consumed oxygen and melted steel and turned human beings into ash and memory. The M2 was an evolution, a refinement of controlled hell. The engineers at the Chemical Warfare Service had learned from the M1's failures. The new model carried 4 gallons of thickened fuel, napalm, though most Marines just called it fugas or goop, pressurized by nitrogen tanks to shoot a stream of liquid fire up to 40 yards. 40 yards of burning gel that stuck to whatever it touched, that couldn't be brushed off or stomped out, that burned at 1200 degrees and consumed everything. The ignition system was more reliable now, a small tank of hydrogen that sparked the fuel as it left the wand, turning the stream into a lance of orange-white fury. The whole apparatus weighed 72 pounds fully loaded and made the man carrying it a priority target for every Japanese rifleman and machine gunner within range. A single bullet in the fuel tanks wouldn't cause an explosion. Napalm wasn't that volatile, but it would leak, and if the fuel ignited, the operator became a human torch. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in minutes. Robert Leader had volunteered for this. Back in Hawaii, drunk on 3 beers and convinced of his own immortality, he'd raised his hand when the company commander asked for flamethrower operators. Extra pay, they'd said. Special duty. He'd imagined himself as some kind of hero, a dragon slayer wielding modern fire. Now, crouched in the volcanic ash with Japanese voices singing in the darkness ahead, he understood what he'd actually volunteered for. To be the point of the spear, the man who goes first into the mouth of hell because someone has to and everyone else is too smart or too terrified to do it. The voices in the cave stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void, heavy and expectant. Kowalski put a hand on Leader's shoulder. Now, Leader stood. His legs moved on their own, some autopilot function of training and adrenaline overriding the part of his brain that screamed at him to run the other direction. 20 yards to the cave mouth. 15. He could see inside now, just barely, the tunnel receding into absolute blackness. 10 yards. His thumb found the trigger. The cave erupted. Muzzle flashes strobed from the darkness. Rifle fire cracking over his head, bullets whining off the rocks around him. Someone behind him screamed. Leader squeezed the trigger and the world turned orange. The M2 roared, a mechanical howl as nitrogen pressure forced napalm through the wand and the ignition spark caught, and suddenly he was holding a river of fire. A stream of burning gel that arced through the air and splashed against the cave entrance and poured inside like liquid hatred. The heat hit him in the face, a physical force that made him squint and turn his head. The flames found the darkness and illuminated horrors. Japanese soldiers, 4 of them, caught in the tunnel mouth, human figures turned to silhouettes of fire, arms raised as if to ward off the sun itself. They didn't scream. That was the thing that would haunt Leader forever. They burned in silence, staggering backwards into the tunnel, carrying the flames with them deeper into the earth. He held the trigger for 10 seconds. 20. The fuel gauge dropped. The stream of fire licked the walls of the tunnel, turned the volcanic rock cherry red, sucked the oxygen from the air. Smoke boiled out, thick and black and chemical, carrying with it the smell that would never leave him. Not in 60 years. Not until the day he died in a clean hospital bed in Pennsylvania surrounded by grandchildren who could never understand. The smell of burning human hair and melting skin and superheated metal. Cease fire! Kowalski's voice cut through the roar. Leader released the trigger. The flames died. The tunnel mouth glowed like the entrance to a forge, heat shimmering in waves. Nothing moved inside. Nothing could. The oxygen was gone, consumed by fire and replaced with carbon monoxide and smoke. Anyone still alive in there was suffocating, if they weren't already burned beyond recognition. The platoon moved forward, rifles up, covering the entrance. Leader stood back, the M2 suddenly feeling even heavier on his shoulders, the weight of what he'd just done adding to the physical burden. A corporal named Martinez edged to the tunnel entrance, peered inside, then turned away and vomited. Jesus Christ, he said. Jesus fucking Christ. Kowalski grabbed Leader's arm. Good work, kid. We're moving to the next one. Intel says there's 17 more caves on this face alone. 17 more. Leader looked up at Mount Suribachi rising above them, riddled with tunnels like a termite mound, every one of them filled with Japanese soldiers who would fight to the death because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary anymore, wasn't even a concept their commander would allow them to consider. General Kuribayashi was not a typical Japanese officer. He'd spent time in America before the war, had walked the streets of Washington, D.C. and seen the factories of Detroit, understood with crystalline clarity that Japan could not win a war of production against the United States. When he was given command of Iwo Jima's defense in June 1944, he knew he wasn't being sent to hold the island. He was being sent to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard, to delay the inevitable, to kill so many Marines that perhaps, just perhaps, the American public would lose its appetite for the war and agree to a negotiated peace rather than the unconditional surrender the Allies demanded. So he built his fortress in the earth. Forget the beaches, he told his men. The Americans will take the beaches. They have too many ships, too many planes, too many men. We cannot stop them from landing, but we can stop them from living. He ordered the construction of tunnels that connected every defensive position, allowing his soldiers to move unseen, to retreat from one position and emerge from another, to appear and disappear like ghosts. He stockpiled supplies for months of fighting. He drilled his men until they could navigate the tunnels in complete darkness by touch alone. He forbade banzai charges, the traditional human wave attacks that had characterized Japanese defensive doctrine on other islands. We will not seek death foolishly, he wrote in orders. We will fight from the caves until we are destroyed. He placed his artillery in caves with sliding steel doors that could be opened to fire and closed before American counter-battery fire arrived. He positioned machine guns in apertures so small that they were nearly invisible, commanding interlocking fields of fire across the black sand beaches where the Americans would land. He turned Mount Suribachi itself into a honeycomb fortress, with the summit serving as an observation post that could direct fire across the entire southern end of the island. Every cave was connected to others through the tunnel network. Kill teams could move through the mountain's interior, striking at American positions and vanishing before artillery could respond. The volcanic rock was hell to dig through, harder than concrete in places, but Kuribayashi's men worked for 8 months with picks and shovels and bare hands, breathing the sulfur-tainted air, excavating their own tomb. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they initially thought they'd caught a break. The beach landing went easier than expected, with lighter resistance than anticipated in the first hours. Some Marines even joked about it, thinking maybe the pre-invasion bombardment. 3 days of naval gunfire that pounded the island until the surf turned gray with volcanic dust had actually worked for once. Then the trap sprung. Kuribayashi waited until the beaches were crowded with men and vehicles, until the Marines had pushed inland and exposed their flanks, until there was no room to maneuver and nowhere to hide. Then he opened fire with everything. Artillery and mortars that had been silent during the bombardment roared to life from hidden positions. Machine guns opened up from caves and pillboxes that were invisible until they started shooting. The black volcanic sand that the Marines were trying to dig into for cover turned out to be loose and unstable, like trying to dig a foxhole in ball bearings. Men sank to their knees in it, exhausted from the effort of just walking. The island became a killing field. In some companies, casualties hit 50% in the first day. The Marines did what Marines do. They pushed forward anyway, up the terrace slopes toward the interior, taking yard after yard at unspeakable cost. But the Japanese weren't dying. That was the thing that made Iwo Jima different from every other island battle. Usually, once you broke their main line, once you overran their positions, Japanese casualties would start to mount. Soldiers would die defending fixed positions or throw themselves in suicidal banzai charges that could be mowed down by machine gun fire. But here, there were no fixed positions to overrun. The Japanese would fire from a cave until it got too hot, then retreat through the tunnels to another position and open fire from a new direction. Artillery would plaster a hillside, turning it to moonscape, and the Japanese would simply move deeper underground and wait for it to stop. It was warfare against an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't outflank, couldn't pin down. The only way to kill them was to go into the earth after them. That's where the flamethrower became indispensable. That's where Robert Leader and men like him became the most valuable and most expendable assets the Marines possessed. Each day for the next week, Leader and his M2 moved up Suribachi's slopes with the advancing infantry, hitting cave after cave. The routine became mechanical, a liturgy of violence repeated with variations. Recon would spot a cave entrance, usually by taking fire from it. The platoon would maneuver into position while mortars and rockets pounded the area around the opening, trying to suppress any Japanese fire. Then Leader would move forward, hunched under the weight of the M2, while 2 riflemen covered him from flanks. Get within range. Wait for covering fire. Sprint the last 10 yards while bullets crack through the air. Hit the trigger. Pour fire into the darkness until the fuel ran low or Kowalski yelled to cease fire. Then engineers would move up with satchel charges and blow the entrance shut, sealing whatever was left inside. Move to the next cave. Repeat. Sometimes they'd hear screaming from inside the caves after the fire died down. Sometimes they'd hear nothing. Once, they heard singing, a Japanese song that Leader didn't recognize, beautiful and sad, that continued for minutes after the flames subsided until engineers threw a satchel charge into the opening and the singing stopped forever. The M2 had a theoretical range of 40 yards, but Leader learned quickly that effective range was more like 25. Beyond that, the stream of burning gel would arc and lose cohesion, splashing uselessly against the ground. 25 yards meant getting close. Close enough to see details. Close enough to see the faces of the men you were burning alive, if they were near the entrance when you fired. Close enough to feel the heat of your own weapon reflected back at you from the superheated rock. Close enough to smell everything. Private Takashi Yamada had been in the Suribachi tunnel complex for 6 days without seeing the sun. He was 20 years old, from a fishing village on Kyushu, and he'd been in the army for 2 years, most of it spent digging these godforsaken tunnels with a pick that raised blisters on top of blisters until his hands were more callous than flesh. He'd never fired his rifle in combat until 4 days ago when the Americans landed. Now he couldn't count how many times he'd fired, how many magazines he'd emptied into the black smoke and chaos outside the cave entrance. Whether he'd hit anyone, he had no idea. The world had contracted to the 12 square feet of volcanic rock where he and 6 other soldiers occupied a small chamber 20 feet inside the mountain. They had a Type 96 light machine gun mounted on sandbags facing the entrance tunnel, boxes of ammunition stacked beside it, a few grenades, and half a canteen of water to share between them. Food had run out yesterday. They'd started with rice balls that turned rock hard in the volcanic heat. Those were gone. Now they chewed on nothing and tried to ignore the hollow ache in their stomachs. Sleep was impossible. Even when the Americans weren't attacking, the island shook continuously from naval bombardment and artillery fire. Dust sifted down from the tunnel ceiling with every explosion, getting into their mouths and noses and eyes. The air was thick with it, thick with sulfur from the volcanic vents that honeycombed the interior, thick with smoke from fires that burned somewhere in the tunnel network, carried through the passages by currents of hot air that made breathing feel like inhaling from a forge. They couldn't evacuate. Lieutenant Sato had been clear about that. "This position is yours to hold until you die," he'd said 2 days ago, before disappearing deeper into the tunnel network. "The general expects every man to kill at least 10 Americans before falling. Do not shame your families. Do not shame the emperor." Yamada didn't know how to feel about that. He loved his family. He loved his country. He believed, or wanted to believe, that what he was doing here mattered, that dying on this ugly rock would somehow mean something. But the Americans just kept coming. Waves of them, endless, like the ocean tide. For every one they killed, 10 more appeared. And they had weapons that shouldn't exist, that violated some unspoken rule of warfare. The flame weapon, the dragon gun. Yamada had seen it used on a neighboring cave 2 days ago, had watched from a crack in the rocks as an American soldier walked forward carrying the strange apparatus and unleashed liquid fire that turned 3 of his comrades into human torches. The screaming had lasted 20 seconds. Felt like 20 hours. Now, sitting in the darkness with his rifle across his lap and his stomach eating itself from hunger, Yamada heard the sounds that meant they were coming again. Explosions, close. The whistle of rockets. The sharp crack of American rifles. Shouting in English, words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. They were coming for this cave. "Ready," Corporal Ito said, checking the machine gun's action. His voice was hoarse from breathing dust and smoke. "Yamada, you and Takahashi cover the flanks. Everyone else fire on my command. Make every shot count." Yamada moved to his position, pressed against the left wall of the tunnel where it curved toward the entrance. His hands shook as he checked his rifle. He had maybe 30 rounds left. After that, a bayonet and whatever prayer he could remember. Light appeared at the tunnel entrance. Gray dawn light that seemed impossibly bright after days in the dark. Shapes moved against it. American voices closer now. Ito opened fire. The machine gun hammered. Muzzle flash strobing in the tunnel. The noise deafening in the confined space. Yamada couldn't see what they were shooting at, just pointed his rifle toward the entrance and pulled the trigger, working the bolt, firing again, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. Then the world turned orange. Yamada had a moment to register what he was seeing. A river of fire arcing through the entrance, splashing against the tunnel walls, flowing toward them like a living thing. Before the heat hit and his mind simply refused to process what was happening. The machine gun fell silent. Ito stood up, his upper body engulfed in flames, and staggered backward without a sound. The smell hit Yamada like a physical blow, overwhelming every sense. His own flesh roasting, hair burning, lungs filling with superheated air that seared from inside. He tried to scream, but the fire had already consumed the oxygen. The darkness took him before the pain could. Robert Leader didn't know he was crying until Sergeant Kowalski grabbed his shoulder and shook him. Leader! Leader, you're done. Cease fire. He released the trigger. The flames died. His face was wet. He could taste salt. The tunnel entrance glowed orange, heat shimmering. Nothing moved inside. Nothing would ever move again. I heard them, Leader said. His voice sounded far away, like someone else was speaking with his mouth. I heard them screaming. Yeah, Kowalski said. Yeah, don't think about it. Come on, we've got 6 more to clear before dark. But that was the thing about the M2, about carrying fire as a weapon. You could not think about it. Every Marine on the island was killing Japanese soldiers. That was the job. That was what they'd been trained to do. Riflemen shot at distant targets, often through smoke or at night, rarely seeing the faces of the men they killed. Artillery dropped shells from miles away, turning human beings into statistics. Even grenade throwers could lob their charges around corners or into bunkers and never witness the actual moment of death. But the flamethrower was intimate. You stood close enough to hear voices, to see silhouettes, to watch your fire wrap around human bodies and consume them. You killed up close and personal, and the weapon didn't just kill. It erased, turned soldiers into ash and charred bone, left nothing recognizable behind. And you had to watch it happen. You had to stand there for 10, 20, 30 seconds with your finger on the trigger, pouring fire into enclosed spaces where men were dying in the most agonizing way humans had devised to kill each other. By February 28th, 5 days after Leader first fired the M2 on Suribachi slopes, Mount Suribachi was declared secure. Marines had reached the summit on the 23rd, raising the first flag. A moment captured in photographs but too small for most troops to see from the beaches. A second, larger flag was raised hours later, and Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured that moment in an image that would become the most famous photograph of World War II. But secure didn't mean safe. The mountain was still riddled with tunnels, still hiding Japanese soldiers who would emerge at night to attack American positions, to cut throats in the darkness, to die on their own terms. Flamethrower teams continued working the caves, burning and sealing, day after day. The battle for the rest of the island was even worse. North of Suribachi, the terrain devolved into a nightmare landscape of rocky ridges and ravines where every yard was contested, where coordinated defense from underground positions turned advances into bloodbaths. The Japanese had prepared killing zones where multiple caves could concentrate fire on American positions, creating crossfires that stopped entire companies cold. Kuribayashi had divided the island into sectors, each with independent command, so that even when communications were cut, his defenders would continue fighting according to doctrine. The Americans adapted. They learned. Navy Seabees brought up bulldozers to push tons of earth over cave entrances, burying the defenders alive when fire wouldn't work. Engineers developed new techniques using pole charges, explosives lashed to long poles that could be shoved into cave entrances before detonation. Infantry learned to work in teams, with one squad suppressing a cave position while flamethrower operators approached from flanks. The M2 became so essential that production was ramped up, with flamethrower units attached to every assault company. The weapon's limitations became clear through brutal trial and error. The fuel load gave you about 10 seconds of continuous fire, though operators learned to fire in shorter bursts to conserve fuel. The tanks had to be refilled constantly, a vulnerable process that required flamethrower operators to retreat to supply points and spend several minutes with their backs to the enemy, while technicians pumped fresh napalm into the tanks. The ignition system could fail, and nothing was more terrifying than pulling the trigger and having the fuel spray out unlit, dousing yourself in jellied gasoline. If that happened, you had seconds to strip the tanks off before someone's muzzle flash turned you into a bonfire. And the Japanese learned too. They learned to wait until flamethrower operators got close, then target them specifically, knowing that killing the flamethrower would stop the assault more effectively than killing 10 riflemen. They learned to dig their tunnels with right-angle turns that would deflect the flame, creating positions where they could fire from safety even as fire poured past them. They learned to time their evacuations, abandoning positions through rear tunnels just before the flames arrived, leaving behind a few soldiers to fight to the death while the rest withdrew to fight again. March turned the island into an abattoir. The casualty lists grew so long that replacements were being fed into combat with minimal training. Fresh-faced kids from the States who'd barely finished boot camp, who lasted hours before being wounded or killed. Leader survived because he was good at his job and because the law of averages hadn't caught him yet. He survived the bullet that passed so close to his head, he felt the pressure wave and heard it crack past his ear. He survived the mortar round that landed 15 feet away and wounded everyone around him but left him untouched. He survived the night a Japanese infiltrator got within 10 feet of his sleeping hole before being shot by a Marine on watch. Each day his world narrowed further. Wake up. Eat something if food was available. Strap on the M2. Move forward with the company. Find caves. Burn them. Seal them. Move on. Sleep if possible, though sleep brought dreams of burning men and the smell that was soaked into his uniform and his skin and the lining of his lungs. He stopped learning the names of replacement flamethrower operators. There was Kowalski, who'd been there from the start and seemed indestructible. There was Martinez, who'd thrown up after the first cave and now barely blinked when pulling the trigger. And there were the others, a rotating cast of faces that appeared and disappeared, killed or wounded or transferred, their names forgotten as soon as they were gone because remembering hurt too much. By mid-March, Kuribayashi's defense was fragmenting. The organized tunnel network that had made the island such a fortress was being systematically destroyed, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. American engineers were learning to pump smoke into tunnel entrances and watch where it emerged, mapping the underground network. Once they understood the layout, they could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, collapsing sections of the network and trapping defenders inside. The flamethrower was the spearhead of this campaign. Engineers might map the tunnels and plan the attacks, but it was men like Leader who executed them, who walked into the fire and brought the fire with them. The mathematics of the battle were staggering. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 would be captured alive. The rest fought until killed or killed themselves. American casualties topped 26,000, with nearly 7,000 dead. That meant one American casualty for every Japanese defender, a ratio unprecedented in the Pacific War. The island was 8 square miles. By the time it was declared secure on March 26, though fighting would continue in pockets for weeks, the Americans had paid roughly 3,200 casualties per square mile. The flamethrower played a decisive role in making those numbers possible. Without it, each cave would have had to be cleared with grenades and satchel charges and small arms fire, a process that took hours and cost lives each time. The M2 could clear a cave in minutes. It was brutally efficient, which is another way of saying it was brutal. Historians would later debate the ethics of using such a weapon, would argue about whether burning human beings alive could ever be justified, even in the context of total war. Veterans who'd used the flamethrower rarely participated in those debates. They understood something the historians couldn't quite grasp from archives and photographs. On Iwo Jima, the choice wasn't between the flamethrower and some more humane alternative. The choice was between the flamethrower and losing hundreds more Marines to an enemy who would fight to the death from positions that couldn't be taken any other way. When you were crouched on volcanic rock while machine gun fire kicked up sand around you and your buddies were dying and the only way forward was through a tunnel where the Japanese waited with rifles and grenades, moral philosophy became irrelevant. You used what worked. The flamethrower worked. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. For the Americans, the flamethrower was a source of both reassurance and horror. You wanted one in your unit because it meant you had a solution to the caves. You didn't want to be the one carrying it because it made you a target and required you to do things that would haunt you forever. For the Japanese, the flamethrower became a symbol of American technological superiority and willingness to employ total brutality. Kuribayashi's defensive doctrine had assumed the Americans would fight conventionally, with rifles and grenades and frontal assaults that could be repelled. He'd prepared for bravery and firepower. He hadn't prepared for fire itself, for a weapon that didn't need to see you to kill you, that came around corners and through cracks and sucked the air from your lungs before burning the flesh from your bones. On March 17th, General Kuribayashi sent his final message to Tokyo. The battle is approaching its end. Since the enemy's landing, even the gods would weep at the bravery of the officers and men under my command. In particular, I am pleased that our troops have maintained their fighting spirit and that not one has surrendered. 3 days later, he would lead a final attack from his command post cave, sword in hand, and disappear into the chaos. His body was never found. The caves where he'd made his final stand were sealed with bulldozers and fire. Robert Leader was rotating back to reserve on March 22nd, when a bullet from a Japanese sniper hidden in a cave they'd thought was sealed hit him in the left shoulder, shattering the collarbone. He was lucky. The bullet missed his fuel tanks by 6 inches. If it had hit the tanks, he would have been drenched in napalm with bullets flying and muzzle flashes everywhere. They pulled him out, patched him up on the beach, and loaded him onto a hospital ship. As the ship pulled away from Iwo Jima's black shores, Leader stood on deck and watched the island recede. It was still burning. Fires from destroyed fuel dumps sent black smoke into the sky. Artillery still pounded the northern ridges where holdouts continued resisting. Even in defeat, even with the battle essentially won, the island still demanded blood. He'd carried the M2 for 31 days. In that time, he'd fired it into 47 different caves. He had no idea how many Japanese soldiers he'd killed. The official count didn't matter anyway. How do you count shadows turned to ash, voices silenced mid-song, human beings reduced to nothing in seconds? Mathematics couldn't capture it. 47 caves, each one a small apocalypse, a hell compressed into minutes. He tried to remember their faces, the few times he'd seen them clearly before the fire took them. Young men, mostly same age as him and his buddies. Soldiers doing their duty, following orders, defending their position with a courage that bordered on insanity. In another life, another war, maybe he could have admired that courage. Here he just burned them. The wound in his shoulder healed. The war ended 5 months later with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A different kind of burning that made the flamethrower seem almost quaint by comparison. Leader came home, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 kids in a small Pennsylvania town, worked 30 years at a steel mill that closed in the 80s. He didn't talk about Iwo Jima. Not to his wife, not to his kids, not to anyone. What would he say? How do you explain what it felt like to pull that trigger, to watch your fire consume human beings, to do it again and again until it became routine? The VFW held reunions. Leader went to one in 1963 and ran into Martinez. They got drunk together and didn't talk about the war until closing time, when Martinez asked the question Leader had been asking himself for 18 years. Do you think they felt it? I mean, do you think it was fast? Leader thought about the screaming he'd heard sometimes, the way figures would stagger backward into the tunnel's trailing fire. He thought about Corporal Takahashi, who'd carried a flamethrower for 2 weeks before a bullet hit his fuel tank and turned him into a torch that burned for 40 seconds while he screamed and no one could help because getting close meant catching fire yourself. I hope so, Leader said. I really hope so. But he didn't believe it. Fire from an M2 flamethrower burned at 1200 degrees, hot enough to melt steel, but it wasn't instantaneous. The napalm was designed to stick, to keep burning, to penetrate every crevice. In the open, you might die quickly from shock or superheated air searing your lungs. In a tunnel, in the enclosed spaces where most of the fighting happened, you'd have seconds, maybe more, to understand what was happening to you. Long enough to feel everything. The nightmares came in waves. Decades would pass without one. Then something would trigger the memory. A bonfire, a house fire on the news, even the smell of barbecued meat. And that night he'd be back on Iwo Jima, standing 30 yards from a cave entrance with 72 pounds of death strapped to his back and Japanese voices echoing from the darkness. He'd wake up sweating, his wife asking if he was okay, and he'd lie and say it was nothing, just a bad dream, go back to sleep. The M2 flamethrower was phased out of service after Vietnam, replaced by more modern weapon systems that could kill from greater distances with less trauma to the operators. The last operational M2s were retired in the 1970s, though a few remain in museums, metal sculptures of a particular kind of warfare that most people would prefer to forget. Military historians still debate the flamethrower's role in the Pacific War. Some argue it was essential, that the cave warfare of islands like Iwo Jima would have been impossible to overcome without it, that it saved American lives even as it incinerated Japanese soldiers. Others argue it represented a moral line crossed, that some weapons are too terrible to employ regardless of military necessity. Both arguments have merit. Both miss the point. The men who carried flamethrowers on Iwo Jima didn't have the luxury of moral philosophy. They had a job: clear the caves so the advance could continue. The M2 was the tool they were given to do that job. They used it because refusing meant their buddies would die clearing those caves with grenades and bayonets, because the Japanese weren't surrendering and someone had to go into the earth after them. Ethics is easy from 70 years away, sitting in a comfortable chair, reading books and watching documentaries. Ethics is complicated when you're 20 years old and scared and angry and your friend just got shot and there's a machine gun firing from a cave and you have exactly one way to silence it. You use the tool that works. Then you live with what you've done. Private Takashi Yamada's family received a form letter in June 1945 informing them that their son had died heroically defending the empire. The letter didn't specify how. It didn't mention that his body was never recovered, that it was burned to ash in a tunnel on Mount Suribachi along with 6 other soldiers, that their remains were mixed with volcanic rock and sealed under tons of earth when American engineers collapsed the tunnel. His mother kept the letter in a box with his school photographs and a lock of his baby hair. She never knew the details. Maybe that was a mercy. The thing about fire is that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about nationality or ideology or moral righteousness. It consumes what it touches with perfect equality, turning Japanese defenders and American attackers alike into carbon and ash and memory. The difference on Iwo Jima was which side controlled the fire. The Americans had the M2. The Japanese had rifles and grenades and a willingness to die that bordered on the religious. In a war where both sides had committed to total victory or total destruction, the side with better technology won. That technology included the flamethrower. 50 years after the battle, a Japanese veteran named Toshio Kobayashi published a memoir about his time on Iwo Jima. He'd been in the northern sector, not under Suribachi, and survived by hiding in a collapsed tunnel for 3 weeks after organized resistance ended, drinking water that seeped through volcanic rock and eating nothing, hallucinating conversations with his dead squad mates until American search teams found him. In the memoir, he wrote about the flamethrower. We called it the dragon weapon. When we heard the roar of its ignition, we knew our time had come. Some men prayed. Some men sang. Some men simply closed their eyes and waited for the fire. I do not blame the Americans for using it. War is not a gentleman's game. They did what they had to do to survive, just as we did. But I will tell you this, there is no worse way to die than by fire. The bullet is merciful. The blade is quick. Fire takes its time. He was right. Fire does take its time. And the men who wielded it on Iwo Jima understood that truth more intimately than anyone should have to. The tunnel networks under Iwo Jima still exist. Most are collapsed or sealed, but some remain intact, dark passages under the island that no one has walked through in 80 years. Occasionally, exploration teams with cameras and lights venture into accessible sections, documenting what remains. They find rusted weapons, broken equipment, and sometimes human remains. Bones mixed with volcanic ash, skulls with bullet holes or blast damage, the archaeology of annihilation. They never find anything in the tunnels that were hit with flamethrowers. Those passages are just smooth black tubes of melted rock. All organic material consumed, no artifacts remaining. Fire is thorough. The Pacific War was full of horrors, each island a laboratory for new forms of industrial death. Flamethrowers were used on every major island from Guadalcanal onward, but Iwo Jima represented the weapon's apotheosis, the place where cave warfare and flame weaponry collided with maximum effect. The lessons learned there would be applied in Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific Campaign, where even more extensive cave systems awaited and even more flamethrower operators would earn their terrible wages. But Iwo Jima held a special place in the imagination of the Marines who fought there. It was the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties in raw numbers. It was the battle where every yard cost blood, where there were no easy victories, no moments of triumph that weren't immediately followed by more dying. And it was the battle where the flamethrower proved that technological superiority could overcome fanatical determination, that science could defeat Bushido, that fire could burn through ideology and leave only ash. The tactical doctrine developed on Iwo Jima became standard for the rest of the war and influenced military thinking for decades after. Combined arms assault with flamethrower support, engineer demolitions, and coordinated infantry movements became the template for clearing fortified positions. The flamethrower's effectiveness led to continued development of flame weapons through the Cold War, including vehicle-mounted systems and improved portable models. Vietnam saw extensive use of flamethrowers in jungle warfare, clearing bunkers and tunnel complexes with the same brutal efficiency they'd shown on Iwo Jima. Only in the 1970s, as changing rules of engagement and public opinion turned against such weapons, did militaries begin phasing out flamethrowers in favor of thermobaric explosives and other systems that could achieve similar effects with less visible horror. But the psychological legacy remained. An entire generation of combat veterans carried memories of using or witnessing flamethrowers in action, memories they largely kept to themselves because civilians didn't want to hear about such things, because explaining it was impossible, because what was there to say? Robert Leader attended the 40th anniversary reunion of Iwo Jima veterans in 1985. Hundreds of men gathered, old now, gray and heavy with the weight of 4 decades, but still recognizable in the way they carried themselves, the way they looked at each other with an understanding that needed no words. The keynote speaker was a retired general who talked about valor and sacrifice and the importance of remembering. Leader listened and nodded in the right places and felt nothing but a vast distance between the words and the reality they supposedly described. Afterward, at the hotel bar, a young reporter interviewing veterans for a local newspaper asked Leader about his experience. "What was your job?" she asked, pen ready. "Flamethrower operator," Leader said. She wrote it down. "That must have been intense. What was it like?" Leader looked at his beer. "How do you compress 31 days of walking nightmare into a soundbite for the local paper? How do you explain that you can still smell it 40 years later, that certain odors make you nauseous, that you see those burning silhouettes in every flame?" "Necessary," he said finally. "It was necessary." The reporter waited for more. Leader said nothing else. She moved on to interview someone with a better story, someone who'd raised the flag or earned a medal or had some narrative arc that made sense. Leader finished his beer and went back to his room and lay in the dark, not sleeping, just existing in the space between then and now, a space that was much narrower than 40 years should have made it. The island appeared in his dreams that night, as it always did when he thought too much about it. Black volcanic sand stretching to the horizon. Mount Suribachi looming like a dark god. And the caves, endless caves, each one a mouth waiting to swallow light and hope and human beings. In the dream, he walks toward one carrying the M2, its weight familiar and terrible. Japanese voices echo from inside, singing something he almost recognizes. He knows what comes next, has dreamed the same sequence 1,000 times. His finger finds the trigger, but this time, before he can fire, a figure emerges from the cave. A young Japanese soldier, Yamada's age, Leader's age, any age that's too young to be doing this. The soldier looks at him, doesn't raise his rifle, doesn't attack, just looks at him with an expression Leader can't decode. Not hatred, not fear, just a profound weariness that transcends language. "I'm sorry," Leader tries to say, but the words won't come. The soldier nods anyway, understanding somehow. Then fire blooms between them, not from Leader's weapon but from everywhere at once, consuming them both, and Leader wakes up with his heart hammering and sweat soaking the sheets. It's 1985. He's 60 years old. The war has been over for 40 years. None of it matters. He sees the soldier's face anyway. The mathematics of trauma don't follow normal rules. 40 years doesn't diminish the weight of 31 days. Safety and comfort and loving family don't erase the memory of what it felt like to burn human beings alive at close range. Time doesn't heal these particular wounds. It just teaches you to function around them, to build a life on top of the buried memories, to smile and work and raise kids and pretend that everything is normal while some part of you is forever standing on volcanic rock with fire in your hands. The official history of Iwo Jima focuses on heroism and importance. The island provided emergency landing sites for B-29 bombers returning damaged from raids on Japan. Over 2,400 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima during the final months of the war, potentially saving 24,000 airmen's lives. This arithmetic was used to justify the battle's cost. 26,000 American casualties to save 24,000 airmen. The math doesn't quite work, but it was close enough for government purposes. What the official history downplays is the human cost that can't be tallied in numbers. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima but came home changed, hollowed out, carrying darkness that would take decades to even partially process. The Japanese families who received form letters and never learned the details of how their sons died. The flamethrower operators like Leader who did their jobs effectively and professionally and paid for it with nightmares that lasted lifetimes. War creates these casualties too. The walking wounded who didn't take bullets but took something else, something that bled out slowly over years. The Battle of Iwo Jima ended officially on March 26, 1945, but Japanese holdouts continued fighting for weeks afterward. The last organized resistance was crushed in late April. Individual soldiers emerged from caves as late as 1949. For years after the war ended, starving and delirious, some surrendering and some choosing to die fighting rather than accept defeat. The Americans turned Iwo Jima into an air base, paved over the battlefields, filled in the craters, sealed the caves. They built runways and hangars and housing, transforming the volcanic rock into something useful. But they couldn't pave over memory. The Marines who'd fought there carried the island with them wherever they went, a weight more permanent than volcanic ash. In 1954, Robert Leader's oldest son asked him what he did in the war. The boy was 10, old enough to know that his father had been a Marine, young enough to think of war as adventure rather than atrocity. Leader looked at his son, hair uncombed, eyes bright with curiosity, still innocent of the world's capacity for horror, and made a decision he'd made 100 times before and would make 1,000 times more. "I was a Marine," Leader said. "We fought in the Pacific. We won. That's all you need to know." His son pressed for details. "Did you shoot anybody? Did you see anybody get shot? Were you scared? Was it exciting?" And Leader deflected each question with increasing firmness until his wife intervened and sent the boy outside to play. That night, lying in bed, his wife asked why he wouldn't talk about it. "Because he's 10, Leader said. "Because I don't want him to know that his father burned men alive for a living. Because some stories don't have a moral that makes sense to tell children." She didn't ask again. The silence became another presence in the house, a weight that everyone acknowledged by pretending it wasn't there. Leader's generation was famous for not talking about the war, for burying their experiences under layers of normalcy and work and forward motion. This wasn't repression in the clinical sense, it was survival. You couldn't function in peacetime while simultaneously processing what you'd done in wartime. So you chose function. You built the life you were supposed to build, raised the family you were supposed to raise, worked the job you were supposed to work. And at night, when the masks came off, you dealt with whatever came bubbling up from the buried places. Mostly you dealt with it alone. The alternative, talking about it, processing it, seeking help, wasn't really available. This was decades before PTSD was recognized as a diagnosis, before therapy was socially acceptable for men, before anyone acknowledged that combat veterans might need more than a parade and a handshake to transition back to civilian life. You were expected to be tough, to handle it, to move on. So that's what they did. They handled it. Some handled it better than others. Leader handled it by working 60-hour weeks at the steel mill, by coaching Little League in summers, by attending church every Sunday and sitting in the pew and trying to reconcile the God of mercy and love with the God who'd presided over Iwo Jima and found no reason to intervene. He handled it by avoiding bonfire parties and barbecues, by leaving the room when war movies came on television, by quietly excusing himself whenever conversations turned to military service. He handled it by never, ever handling it, just building walls around the experience and getting on with life. It mostly worked. The nightmares came less frequently as years passed. The smell of burning didn't trigger panic attacks, just a momentary dislocation he learned to conceal. He functioned. That was the goal, and he achieved it. But something was missing. Some essential piece of himself had been left on Iwo Jima, incinerated along with everything else the M2 touched. He went through the motions of life, love and work and raising kids and growing old, but always from a distance, always slightly removed, as if he were watching someone else live his life while he stood apart, observing. His wife noticed. She never said anything directly, but sometimes she'd look at him with an expression of infinite sadness, and he'd know she understood that the war had taken something from him that couldn't be recovered, that she'd married a ghost of the man who'd carried fire up the slopes of Suribachi. The Marine Corps had a motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Leader had been faithful to his duty, to his brothers, to his country. He'd done what was asked without question or hesitation. He'd carried the M2 into 47 caves and pulled the trigger each time and watched his fire consume the enemy and never once refused an order or shirked his responsibility. The Corps had trained him well. The training just didn't include what to do afterward, how to live with what you'd done, how to integrate the man who burned people alive with the man who kissed his children goodnight and paid his taxes and mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings. You were supposed to figure that out yourself. Most never did. In the 1960s, as America slid into Vietnam and a new generation discovered what war actually meant, Leader watched with a sick sense of recognition. The news showed footage of Marines clearing tunnels in Suribachi and the Iron Triangle, using the same flamethrowers, the same tactics, learning the same terrible lessons he'd learned 2 decades earlier. He wondered if those young men would carry the same weight, if they'd come home and build the same walls, if their sons would ask the same questions and get the same non-answers. He suspected they would. War doesn't change. The technology improves, the politics shift, the locations vary, but the essential horror remains constant. Young men are sent to kill other young men for reasons that seem important to people far from the fighting. Some die. Some survive. All are changed. The ones who survive come home and try to forget and fail and spend the rest of their lives negotiating between who they were before and who they became in the crucible. The lucky ones find ways to integrate both selves. Most just split the difference and live divided. Leader volunteered at the VA hospital in Pittsburgh for a few years in the 70s, thinking maybe he could help younger veterans transition back to civilian life. He lasted 8 months. Too many hollow eyes staring back at him. Too many stories that mirrored his own. Too much shared trauma that couldn't be processed or resolved, only endured. The work was important, but he couldn't sustain it. Being around that much pain, even in service of healing, required opening doors he'd spent decades keeping closed. Some doors are better left shut. The VA therapist he spoke with, a young doctor who'd never been in combat, suggested he might benefit from talking about his own experiences, processing the trauma rather than burying it. Leader smiled and thanked him and never went back. What would talking accomplish? The men he'd burned were still dead. The caves were still sealed. The nightmares would still come. Words couldn't change any of that. Better to maintain the walls, keep functioning, live the life he'd been given. Talking was for people who believed healing was possible. Leader wasn't sure he believed that anymore. Mount Suribachi stands 556 feet above sea level, a volcanic cone of dark stone that dominates the southern end of Iwo Jima. Today, it's part of a Japanese self-defense force base, off-limits to most civilians. The tunnels are still there, sealed but not destroyed, a subterranean maze that holds the remains of hundreds of Japanese soldiers who were never recovered, whose families never got closure, who simply vanished into the volcanic rock and became part of the island itself. Every year, Japanese veterans and family members make pilgrimages to Iwo Jima, conduct Buddhist ceremonies on the beaches where their loved ones died, pray for the souls still trapped in the caves. American veterans make similar pilgrimages, walking the ground they fought over, trying to find meaning or closure or just connection to the younger men they used to be. The two groups sometimes meet, former enemies now old and frail, exchanging bows and awkward handshakes, each seeing in the other a mirror of their own loss. These reunions are carefully orchestrated, always civil, often moving, but they're also fundamentally incomplete. Veterans on both sides talk about honor and duty and sacrifice. They rarely talk about the specific mechanics of killing, about what it felt like to pour fire into tunnels or to wait in those tunnels for the fire to come. Some experiences resist language. Some truths are too raw to be spoken aloud, even among people who shared them. So the reunions focus on generalities, on abstract concepts like courage and endurance, and everyone goes home feeling slightly hollow, having touched the surface of memory without diving into its depths. Robert Leader never went back to Iwo Jima. He was invited multiple times. The Marine Corps organized several official return trips for veterans, but he always declined. "I left everything important there," he told his wife once. "There's nothing left for me to find." She didn't understand, but she didn't push. You learned not to push when it came to his war experiences. Some subjects were marked with invisible signs. "Do not enter." You respected the boundaries and hoped that was enough. The M2 flamethrower weighed 72 pounds and could shoot fire 40 yards and cost $93 to manufacture. The first entry was dated February 19, 1945. "We landed today. The beach is hell. Black sand that sucks at your boots. Already lost guys I knew from training. They gave me the flamethrower. I don't know why. I don't know if I can do this." The entries continued, sporadic and brief, documenting the campaign through the eyes of a 20-year-old who was learning that he was capable of things he'd never imagined, terrible things, necessary things. Some entries were just single lines. "Burned 3 caves today. Martinez got hit. Still alive. Can't sleep. Keep smelling it." Others were longer, more reflective. "I try not to think about who's inside the caves when I fire. If I think of them as people, as men with families and lives and dreams, I can't do it. So I don't think. I just pull the trigger and watch the fire go where it's supposed to go, and when it's done, we move to the next one. This is the job. This is what I signed up for, even if I didn't know what it meant." Sergeant Kowalski says not to dwell on it, that the Japs would do the same to us if they had the chance, that this is war and war doesn't have rules, only winners and losers. I guess he's right. I guess it doesn't matter what I think about it. The caves need to be cleared. Someone has to do it. That someone is me. The last entry was dated March 22, 1945. "Got shot today. Going home. I should feel lucky. I should feel relieved. I just feel empty. We won, I guess. We'll take the island. But I don't feel like a winner. I feel like something got burned away inside me, along with everything else the flamethrower touched. I don't know if I'll ever feel whole again. I don't know if I deserve to." Leader's son read the journal twice, then closed it and put it back in the box. He never showed it to his siblings, never mentioned it to his mother. Some things, he realized, were private. Some confessions were meant to stay buried. His father had carried this weight alone for 60 years. Disturbing that solitude now, after death, seemed like a violation. The box went back in the attic. The journal remained unread. And Robert Leader's experience with the M2 flamethrower on Iwo Jima stayed where he'd left it. Locked away, acknowledged but not examined, a burden carried in silence. This is how history works, in the spaces between official records and personal memory. The archives will tell you that flamethrowers were deployed extensively on Iwo Jima, that they proved tactically decisive in neutralizing Japanese cave defenses, that the M2 model represented a significant improvement over earlier designs. The numbers are clear. X number of flamethrower operators deployed. Y number of caves cleared. Z casualties inflicted. Clean data, easy to analyze, useful for teaching future officers about combined arms tactics and fortification assault. What the archives won't tell you is what it cost. Not in dollars or casualties, but in human terms, in nightmares and silences and relationships that never quite connected because part of the man was still standing on volcanic rock with fire in his hands. History is written by people who weren't there, who can look at the tactical situation and determine that yes, the flamethrower was necessary, its use justified by the circumstances, its effectiveness undeniable. And they're right, technically. But they never had to smell it. They never had to watch it. They never had to live with it. The men who did, they understood something that can't be captured in official histories or academic papers. They understood that some victories cost more than defeat, that some weapons exact a price that goes beyond the physical, that you can do the right thing and still lose something essential in the process. Robert Leader understood this. He never articulated it, never wrote about it beyond those brief journal entries, never found words adequate to express the contradiction at the heart of his experience. But he carried it anyway, the weight of necessary evil, the burden of survival, the knowledge that he'd done his duty and his duty required him to become something he could never fully reconcile with the man he wanted to be. 47 caves. 31 days. 60 years of aftermath. The island was conquered. But no one who held a flamethrower ever felt victorious.